Good morning. How are you? No? Yeah? Second day? So I want to thank you so much for having me here in ReactiveConf. My name is Shirley. I'm a freelance software engineer, and I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I build data visualizations for the web. I built data visualizations for product. I built them for story. I built them all with D3, and I also used mostly React with my D3. So when I mention to anybody that I use React and D3 together, the question that I always get is, how should I use D3 and React together? Who should get control of the DOM? And I want to rephrase that question to be, who needs control of the DOM? After all, if we want React to keep track of our updates, we need the virtual DOM, and that needs access to the DOM. And since D3 is for doing data visualization in the web, that, of course, also needs to render to the DOM, right? Actually, D3 only needs access to the DOM in 3 different places. The first with transitions, or animations between one state to the next. So what happens here is that we tell D3 exactly the attributes that we want to animate and transition. And D3 goes in and figures out all of the in-between points, all of the interpolations for us, and updates them directly to the DOM so that we don't have to. The second is with axes. So every single time, it's very boring and repetitive for us if every single time that we need an axis, we have to go in and create our own ticks and labels in SVG and Canvas. So we tell D3 the kind of axes we want, and D3 goes and does it directly in the DOM for us. And finally, we have brushes. So much like axes with brushes, it's quite a really repetitive task for us. If we have to, every single time we want it, to create the brushable area, the little rectangle, to bind the event listeners for the draggable areas. So we tell D3 the parts that we want to be able to brush, and D3 goes and does it for us. And with all of the things that we so commonly associate with D3, things like the layouts, the force layout, the tree maps, chord maps, and geo with projections and maps, shapes like line charts, area charts, pie charts, all of these things that we so commonly associate with D3 actually doesn't need access to the DOM at all. Instead, what happens is that we tell D3 our raw data, we give D3 our raw data, and D3 gives us back that same raw data, but now with the information to be able to render to the screen space. And that, to me, is really the power of D3, which is that it helps transform for us our raw data. So let's say average temperature of a city across time. And it takes that raw data and translates it into screen space. And that could be XY positions, that could be radii, that could be colors. And the way that I like to think about D3 is that it helps us abstract away all of the most common repetitive tasks of building data visualization in the web so that we don't have to. Which means that for most of our use cases, we can just have D3 do the data calculation and React do the rendering. And it's only when we need these specific things from D3, the transitions, the axes, the brushes, it's only when we need these that we have D3 doing both the data calculation and the rendering, and having React kind of just hang out in the background for structural support. But before I start talking and getting into the how of using React and D3 together, I want to take a step back and talk about the why. Why are we trying to use React and D3 together? After all, if all we want is a data visualization, then D3 is more than enough to do the job. Take, for example, don't take, for example, because it's not loading. There we go. Take, for example, this visualization I did last year of the top summer blockbusters in the last 2.5 decades, reimagined as flowers. Each of the petals are parental guidance ratings. Each of the colors are their genres. And the number and size of petals are the movie's IMDb ratings out of 10. So there's some really, really beautiful ones in here, like The Dark Knight Rises. I always love Harry Potter. There's Inception right here. But my absolute favorite that I always love telling everybody is the 1997 Batman and Robin, because of how tiny and cute it is. But the only user interaction I have in this visualization is a click interaction for the user to open up the corresponding IMDb page. I also have this visualization of the 4 years of vacations and 20,000 colors. For this visualization, I took all of my vacation photos, about 4,000 of them. I extracted the 5 primary colors out of each of those photos, and I grouped them by the trip that it was taken on and arranged them by the date of the trip that it was taken on. So this is one of my favorite visualization pieces I've done. It's not a very complicated one, but the reason why that I love it so much is because I learned so much about myself from this, which is that, so when I travel, I like taking pictures of nature. So I love taking pictures of the mountains, of trees, of the sky. I love water, rivers, oceans. So all of these blues and greens made a lot of sense to me. But I was really, really confused as to why I had so many oranges and so many reds, because there's no way that I was waking up for all of those sunrises or watching that many sunsets. So I took a look at what those pictures were, and it turns out they were actually food pictures, which means that this is what I mean by I say that I learned so much about myself, which is that, for example, this particular trip to Asia in 2014, that's my Japan trip. Apparently, all I did in Japan was eat and nothing else. And this trip is to Iceland, so you can see that I took a lot of like waterfall pictures. And again, in New York, apparently all I do is eat. So I learned a lot about myself. But as you can see, the only interactions here are hover interactions to see more details about that specific date of the trip. And so the way that I like to think about it is D3 is more than enough to do the job if all I have or want is a visualization with hover, click, and other simple interactions. But if instead I want a visualization with a whole UI built around it, then I need React. Then React comes in very handy. This is an example, a very, very simple example I made of an expense app to show how React and D3 can work together. Each of these circles are categories I've made. Each of these little dots are expenses. They're actually my expenses from June. It's a little bit embarrassing because of like how much, anyways. So each of these dots, these expenses, are then grouped into the date that the expense was made. And the date is colored, the background is colored by how much I spent on that date. So the redder that it is, the more that I spent, which is not good. And the greener it is, the less I spent, which is good. I can then toggle through all of the weeks. I can drag one expense from one date to another to edit the date, and you can see that the background color is adjusted automatically. I can, of course, drag it back. I can drag one expense over a category to link them, or even multiple. I can drag them back to unlink them. And I can also, this is my favorite interaction that I built. I had a really fun time with it. But I can also add a category, let's say coffee. I enter, and it goes in there. Yay! So I'm very, very proud of this interaction. It's like such a simple one, but yeah. So I can add a category, and I can also delete any of my categories. With this example, I'm using React to help me update automatically with the visualization with each user manipulation of the underlying data. I also got to work with a company called BrainSights last October, where they went and tracked viewer brain data as they watched the final US presidential debate. And I got to work with them in visualizing it. So this up here is the overview of the 90 minutes of the debate, where each of the line charts is the overall or the viewer engagement during the debate itself, with the background colored with the speaker. And I can drag this brush along any part to dig into that particular moment. I can select a particular viewer demographic to dig into, and I can hover along the bottom part to look into the details of that particular moment. And for this visualization, oops, no. There we go. And for this particular visualization, I use React to link multiple parts of the visualization together so that when the user interacts with one part of the visualization, the rest of the visualizations update to match. And finally, this is an interactive visualization of every line in the musical Hamilton. For this particular one, each of the dots represent a set of lyrics from the musical itself. And as I scroll down the screen, the dots follow me. And as I scroll through the analysis, my findings, the correct parts of the correct songs are highlighted until I get to my very end, where I give the reader my exploratory tool that I use to do my own analysis, where they can filter by any set of characters in the musical, any of the conversations that they had, and any recurring themes, and dig into the remaining lines and remaining songs so that the reader can do their own analysis. And for this one, I use React to manage the initial scroll as well as the final exploratory tool. So I use React with D3 when I need to componentize my visualizations and be able to manage the state as my user interacts with my visualizations. Now that we've talked about the why of using React and D3 together, I want to get back to talking about the how. How to use React and D3. The way that I like to think about my visualization, my React visualization components, is as self-contained components, where if I pass it in raw data, the visualization component is in charge of translating that raw data into screen space. rendering that data, and managing the interactions with that data. So let's look at this really, really simple example of a node and link graph. The only interactions I have are this update button to update the graph, and the ability to select one of the nodes and highlight or update the opacities of its neighboring nodes and links. And let's take a look at this with the React doing the rendering and D3 doing all of the data calculations. So here's the full code. I only have an app component and a graph component. And don't worry about reading through all of the code, because this is all available online, and I'll tweet it out later. So the app component is in charge of getting the graph component, loading in the graph component, and rendering the update button. And it's also in charge of getting the new data when the user interacts and hits that update button. And the graph component is in charge of taking that raw data that's been passed in from the parent as props, and I use D3 force layout to calculate its X and Y positions. And here, the best practice I've established for myself over the years is that I make a very clear distinction. I make a very clear mental distinction of where I put my data calculations. So any calculation that's related to rendering the visualization itself goes into this visualization component. And anything else, any user manipulation of the data, any edits, any updates from the servers, is taken care of elsewhere, in this case, in the app component. I take the data that's been calculated with the new X and Y coordinates, and I pass it, and I use it in my render function, and loop through it to create my SVG circles and lines. I of course call the data calculation function before my render function in the React lifecycle. So in this case, in my component will mount, and component will receive props. And the reason why I like putting it in my component will receive props is that it has the benefit of only being triggered when the parent passes in new props. In other words, when the user has updated the data has been mutated in some way. And it does not get called when state is set on the component, which means that it helps me avoid unnecessary recalculations of the data. And it has the added benefit of, if I want to, after I calculate all of my data, if I want to then set that date onto my component state, I can do that without triggering an additional extraneous React lifecycle. And finally, the user interaction of clicking on a node, selecting a node to highlight its neighboring nodes and links. The only thing I have to do here is set that selected node as state in the event callback. And I use that information in my render function to calculate the nodes and links that should be highlighted so that I can take that data and then use it in the looping of to create my SVG circles and lines. I can use that data to set the opacities and return it in that same render function. So when React renders, if the user interaction does mutate the data, propagate that update from the parent and recalculate the data, and component will receive props. If the user interaction does not mutate the data, like in the case of selecting and highlighting the neighboring nodes and links, set state in the component and calculate and render. Now let's take a look at that same exact example, but now with D3 doing both the rendering and the calculations. The app component remains exactly the same as before, but the graph component has changed significantly. The most significant change being that in the render function, I no longer return my SVG circles and lines, and I return instead an empty SVG container, so that I can take that empty SVG container and wrap it around into a D3 selection to use later in my render code. Also, in my component did mount and component did update, I call all of my calculate and render functions. In my calculate function, my calculate data, that hasn't changed at all from my previous version. I still use D3 force layout to get my X and Y positions. But what has changed is that I've taken that calculate highlight, calculating the neighboring nodes and links, I've taken that code out of the render function, and I put it into, I have it be called in the component did mount and component did update, so that in the next render step, when D3 is doing the rendering, I can use that same information when I'm entering and exiting and updating the opacities. And here for best practice, the way that I like to think about my D3 render code is that it should render exactly the visualization, it should be a layout for a blueprint for what the visualization should look like given any props and any component state. Much like how you would think of and format what your React render function returns. And this is so that if in the future I want to do any additional features or interactions, all I have to do is write the code to change the data, and the visualization will render correctly with very little additional code change. And finally, that user interaction of selecting a node. It looks exactly the same as before. All I'm doing is setting that selected node on my component state, and I'm letting that same React lifecycle, what I've already set up in the component did update, to take care of rendering all of the correct visualizations for me. And a final note on performance. If the user interaction does not require a full recalculation of the data, a full re-rendering of the visualization, I update the subset in should component update and return false to terminate the rest of the render cycle, the React lifecycle. So when D3 does the rendering, define exactly what the visualization should look like in component did mount and component did update. And never, ever, ever let D3 and React control the same parts of the DOM, or else really, really bad bugs. So at this point, you might be like, WTF, Shirley? This is exactly what I already go through in my day-to-day when I create my non-visualization React components. What gives? And you're exactly right, but that's also absolutely my point, which is that as front-end developers, the design of data visualization might be foreign to us, but the implementation of it, the coding of it in the browser shouldn't be. It's just like any other UI project, and the thought processes that we go through are exactly the same when we architect and implement a data visualization project. So when we talk about the how of React and D3 together, there's already a lot of really great literature out there, but we still haven't seemed to have agreed on the one best approach. And to me, I think that's absolutely okay. Because to me, the most important thing is that you and your team agree on the best approach for your project. And that brings me to my final point, which is that there's been a lot of really great advancements and improvements that's been made in the design of data visualization. But since the browser has been, or since data visualization has been in the browser for the last few years, I'm really excited as we go forward to see what can we take and apply to D3 and data visualization that we already do with React and the UI. So as we go forward, I'm excited and hopeful that we'll stop concentrating and talking so much about the how of React and D3 together and start talking about the what. What can we make? What can we create with D3 and React that will push forward the practice and fields of data visualization and user interface? Thank you.
Shirley, thank you very much. Now we have time for questions. So let's put a slide on. I'm gonna stay right here. Guide you through that. So question number 1: are your demos online?
Yeah. So all of my stuff. This is all. Oh, I have my website, sxywu.com. Oh, I don't have internet, but all of that is online. All of them you can find on my Twitter. All those slides are online.
Great, fantastic. Next question. Would it be possible to make D3 use React for rendering or using the React's VDOM instead of the actual one?
Say that again?
Right there.
Yeah, so the first approach, wait, so you're saying have D3 use the virtual DOM instead. There's actually been a component library called React Faux DOM, which does that exact same thing. It passes in the React virtual DOM to D3 selections instead of actual DOM to D3, and that's how it does it. I've never tried it, but it's possible.
Okay. Next question is from Hakim. Is creating graphs your job or a hobby?
Both.
Okay, that was easy. The next one. Have you tried letting D3 render to a fake node that can translate to virtual DOM using instead like React Faux DOM? Then React can render D3 animations! Exclamation mark.
Exclamation mark. I personally never tried it just because I don't like to rely too much on like third-party libraries. I only like to rely on like well-established, well-supported with like huge communities, and that's why I use D3 and React. I've never used component libraries, but as for animations, I actually prefer to let D3 do the animations. I don't care about React doing my animations, and recently I used Greenstock to do my animations. So I use React, D3, and Greenstock, and I think they work really well together.
Okay. Next one is, how are you testing with live data? Any limitations in performance?
I've actually never worked with live data. So I can't quite answer that question. But in terms of performance, the limitations in the DOM is with SVG, I can render up to about 3,000 nodes. And if I want to do any fancy animations on it, then it goes down to 1,000 SVG nodes. In Canvas, I think I've seen the upper bound of tens of thousands of visualization elements. So I would imagine that that's exactly the same when you're doing live data.
Okay. Where do you keep the state?
Where do I keep state? In the component.
Okay. Fair enough. What about responsivity? How does D3 handle it OOB?
Does OOB stand for? Sorry, what? Out of the box. Okay. I've actually never heard of that. But in terms of responsivity, D3 doesn't do it. You have to do it yourself. All D3 does is help you basically get data onto the screen. And you are in charge of telling it your screen size, so which means that if you have a window resize, you have to tell D3 that the window has resized. D3 doesn't do any of that.
Great. Thank you very much, Shirley. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.